G'day and welcome to another episode of Tomo's Tune-Ups. On this episode, we're not working on the Mini, instead we're working on my wife's Mazda. I'm going to show you how to replace an Intank fuel filter, spark plugs, along with front brake pads and rotors. Now before we start, don't forget to like and subscribe and leave your comments in the section below for things that you want to see me do. Now I'm going to show you what tools you're going to need to do the job. So here's what we're going to need. We're going to use the drain tin to catch any of the brake dust from the brakes when we take them off. We've got a jack and some stands, a couple of screwdrivers, a ratchet, an extension, some gloves so we don't get overly dirty, my electric ratchet, a 1/2-inch breaker bar, dead blow hammer, both 3/8 and 1/2-inch sockets, along with the parts we're going to be using, the rotors, the brake pads, the spark plugs, along with the intake fuel filter, and a little wheel chock to stop the car rolling. So the first step we're going to do is just get the wheel chock. You can use a brick or a piece of timber, and this is just going to go down behind the rear wheel. That way, if the car's going to move, it's going to want to lock straight onto there, and that way it's not going to roll. So the first thing we're going to do is just put some gloves on. That way we're not going to get overly dirty, and it's going to be easy to clean off as well. So to get to the spark plugs, we're going to remove the intake pipe just here, along with this 10mm. We're going to undo the air box. There's another 10mm just hiding down behind here. Once that all comes off, we're then going to remove the coils and pull the spark plugs out. Right, so now that we've loosened the air box, we've pulled the top part off to the side. We've gotten the 10mm bolt out from behind, and then that'll just come straight off. And we're going to move on to removing the plugs. Okay, so as you can see, I've pulled the top half of the airbox upwards, and I've just wedged the box of gloves underneath there. That'll give us enough room. Then all we're going to do is just remove the 4 bolts on each coil, pull out the coils, and then remove the plugs. So make sure that when you take bolts out, you keep them all together. That way you're not going to lose them, and you know exactly where they are. I'm going to stick mine up on the plenum chamber there. Now each coil will just pull straight out quite easily. So you just set them off to the side. Sometimes they can be at different lengths. So it'll be a good indication to mark them beforehand if you didn't want to get them confused with the others and get a bit of a misfire happening. Just want to work it out nice and easy. Once it's loose, you can then generally unwind it by hand. So I couldn't find my magnet, so we're just going to use a pair of long nose pliers, put it down there, pull it out one by one, and sit them off to the side. Now I like to separate them all. That way you can go and compare each cylinder. That way you know if there's any problems with any of the cylinders, which cylinder it specifically is. Now once you pull them out, you want to have a bit of a look. This one has been burning quite well. It has been running a little bit hot, mainly because of the fuel that we've been using in it. If it smells quite oily, chances are you might have an internal oil leak inside the car. And if it smells a bit fuely and it's a bit wet, chances are you probably have a fuel-related problem like a leaking injector. So what we're going to be doing is getting the new spark plug and just holding it up side by side, making sure that they are exactly the same length. That way we're not going to cause any problems with the vehicle. If, for instance, the new plug is significantly longer, do not install it. If this plug is significantly shorter, do your research, make sure that you've got the right plug. The reason you don't install it if it is longer is because as the piston comes up, it will then smash the top of the spark plug, which will then cause damage, cause the car to run rough, and likely not even start. Now, in terms of the porcelain end, which is the side here, it's not going to matter if it's a little bit longer because the coil is then going to take up the extra distance. Now, once you've checked the spark plug length of one, you're going to go and check each individual plug. That way you can guarantee that all the plugs you've been supplied are exactly the same and there's none that's different. Don't ever just assume that spark plugs you've been given are the correct ones for the car. Always match it up, and if they're wrong, do your research, go back to the shop and ask them, are these the correct ones for my vehicle? Okay, so spark plugs have what we call a crush washer, which is this one here. So as you tighten it up, it'll start to get firm. Once it starts to seat against here, you either want to do it to 25 Newton meters or 3/4 of a turn and then stop. The reason why you don't want to go any further is the porcelain here insulates the spark plug. So if this porcelain is cracked, the spark is going to travel down through the top of the electrode and then jump directly out to the side, causing misfire, causing the spark plug not to fire at all. So you're going to tighten each one by hand first, and then we're going to go and tighten them up using the ratchet. So we're going to do it up just lightly with a ratchet until it starts to seat. So you'll know it starts to seat when it starts to get a little bit firm to turn it, and then we're going to turn it 3/4 on each spark plug. That'll ensure that the spark plug is done up to the right torque setting and it's not over tight and damaging the porcelain. Now that's starting to slow down a little bit now, so we're almost there. Okay, I can start to feel it. So we're just going to go 3/4 of a turn. 1, 2, 3. And that's all you want to be doing. Once we've installed the spark plugs, we're then going to reinstall each of the ignition coils, making sure it seats all the way down in there. Then we're going to reinstall the bolts for the coils, tighten them up. So next thing we're going to do is just install the airbox. We're then going to install the 3 bolts, tighten them up, and then reinstall the top cover. Once the 3 bolts are done up, we're then going to reinstall the top of the airbox and reattach it. So this one has 4 clips, so I'm just going to go around and reinstall each of the 4 clips to make sure that it doesn't induce any extra air that is unfiltered. Once it's done up, we're then going to reconnect this one down here along with the pipe for the throttle body. Last piece of the puzzle is to reinstall the pipe. That's done, so now we're off to the next job. Okay, so the next thing we're going to be doing is removing my son's baby seat. It's just got the easy ISOFIX buttons on each side, so we're just going to release both of those and unclip it. Do the same on this side. And then we're going to release the one in the back. Okay, so once it's undone, we can then take it out. Now, I should have explained this earlier, but the reason why we're taking out my son's seat is to remove the rear passenger seat. That's because the fuel filter is built into the fuel pump. If it's an inline fuel filter, it's quite easy to do, but this one, we need to remove the entire back seat to do it. Now, a handy little trick as well is to open the fuel flap and take the fuel cap off. That way it relieves all the pressure inside the tank. That way when we go to remove the fuel filter, we're not going to send fuel absolutely everywhere. Now, most of these back seats, you just grab the ends, give it a pull on one side, do the same on the other, and then it'll come straight out. Make sure that when you take the seat out, you put it in a safe spot. That way it's not going to get dirty, trodden on, or you're going to bring dirt back into your car. Hey, what do you know? Found $2. That'll get me a Slurpee later. Now, the fuel pump is under this cover, so we're going to get a couple of Phillips heads to remove the cover, and then we're going to start pulling the pump out. Once again, set the screws off to the side. That way you're not going to lose them. Now, this cover is generally glued on there, so it might come off quite difficult, but this one came off easily. So there's one line on this fuel pump, which is just directly out from the pump, and then there's a connector as well. So we're going to remove the connector first, and then we're going to remove the clip for the fuel line, and then take the fuel line off. Now, it is advised also to make sure that you wear safety glasses with this. Obviously, fuel is under pressure. When you're removing this, you don't want to get it in your eyes. Now, because I don't have glasses on me to protect my eyes, I'm just going to use the rag, put it over the top, and slowly release the pipe. That way, any fuel is going to hit the rag and not my eyes. Okay, so now that it's off, we're then going to remove the top ring off the fuel pump. Now that we've got the fuel line off and the connector, we're just going to grab my screwdriver, we're going to apply it on this edge, and we're going to get my hammer and give it a bit of a tap. Now, there are special tools in which you can use to remove these clamps, but I find this is the best method. Just be careful in case you do punch a hole inside the tank. Once you've got a hole in it, you're screwed, so just be careful. Okay, so now that we've started to pull it up, we just want to do it nice and easy. That way we're not going to spill too much fuel. So now that we have the fuel pump out of the car, we're just going to go up here and we're going to empty it into a container. That way we're not going to spill fuel all over the driveway. So around the fuel pump, we're going to have this ring. We just want to make sure that we preserve that and we don't destroy it, because that's what's going to seal the fuel pump to the tank. Once the fuel pump is finished draining, we're then just going to take it inside of the workbench, in which we're going to pull it apart and we're going to replace it. So it's going to be a bit weird with me only showing my torso, but I'm just gonna demonstrate to you how to replace this and the best way I possibly can. So all we're gonna do is just sit the fuel pump there, then we're gonna work around the outside, and we're gonna remove the fuel sender unit first, which is this bit here. Now you don't wanna damage this arm at all, only because if you do, you then won't have a good fuel reading. So first thing we're gonna do is grab a pair of long nose pliers, go around to the side of the fuel sender unit, and all we're gonna do is clamp this little clip here, and that'll just pull straight up to release the fuel sender unit. Now, once again, just make sure you don't damage or bend that, otherwise you're not gonna get a good fuel reading. We're just gonna unclip all those wires all the way around until we can release it from the top of the fuel pump, which in this case, we can do a bit later on. So inside we have a couple of connectors. We're just gonna remove those. Try to remember where exactly they go as well. So this one with the blue and yellow, which is a fuel sender unit, that's gonna go towards the outside. And then the black and red one, which is gonna be for the pump, that's gonna go down towards the bottom. Okay, so the next thing we're gonna do is go around and just remove each of these clips. This will just hold the fuel pump into the housing. Now, once again, just be careful with it because it is plastic, it can break. Okay, so you just want to make sure that it comes off nice and easily and it's not being forced. Now this down here is a fuel pressure regulator. So this is what regulates the fuel pressure and prevents any extra fuel going up there and causing any concerns. Just got a screwdriver in there just to pull it out. Now that O-ring, we want to be changing at the same time. Well, what do you know? There's two O-rings, so we want to be changing both those O-rings at the same time. Otherwise, failure to do so can lead in zero fuel pressure. So then that comes straight apart, and there's one more connector inside there, which we should be able to remove. So I just grabbed the new one out. We're just going to have a quick look and see what we need to change over. Now, this is a complete assembly other than the bottom hat and the pump. So what we need to do is put this aside. The pump is just inside here, which is where this gauze is at the bottom. So this is a pre-filter for the pump. So we're going to remove that first. So we need to reuse that. So we put that off to the side. Now, with this fuel pump, in order to release it, we need to push it out through the bottom. So there's a couple of clips at the top we're just going to release. So then that pump, move that off to the side. That pump will then pull straight out. Once again, if there's an O-ring there, make sure you either replace it or reuse it. So we're going to keep that all together. Now, the only bit looks like we're going to be reusing is the bottom bit. So we're just going to remove the connector from inside there, which is just down in there. Okay, so that all comes apart. This is the only piece we're reusing. So this one will go off to the side. The only thing we need to make sure that we get is the wiring for the fuel pump and for the sender unit as well. So it comes straight off to the side. This one can go straight in the bin. Now, generally when you buy a new fuel pump or a fuel filter, it comes in new O-rings. This one doesn't, so we're gonna have to make sure that we reuse them. Now, I just realized at the very top, there is a connector on the new one, so we can get rid of the old one. That way we don't have to worry about it leaking or reusing an old part. That'll just slide straight up in there. Make sure you push it all the way home. You should generally hear it click and it will seat nice and easy. So the next thing we're going to do is just get the gauze and we're going to clip that straight onto the bottom. Okay, so it turns out the hat that we removed, we didn't actually have to because it comes with a new one and it's already got the connectors built in there. So that will go straight in the bin as well. Now there is a spring as well, so that just needs to go back onto there and then reline it up, push it back in all the way down. Now once she's clipped in, get it around and just make sure that all of the clips go in each side. That way it secures it to the housing. So once all the clips are then in, we're then going to reinstall the fuel sender unit. So this will only go in one way. It just slides in just down through the side. Once it audibly clicked, you then want to reroute the wiring as well. Okay, so once the wiring has been rerouted, I'm then going to reinstall the fuel pump wiring. Now, if you're ever unsure where the fuel pump wiring goes, if they have the same connectors for the fuel pump along with the sender unit, all you need to do is refit it, reconnect the fuel line, reconnect the connector at the top of the fuel pump, switch the ignition on and make sure that your fuel gauge works. So long as the fuel gauge is reading, you know you've done it the right way. If it's not, you've got them around the wrong way. We're going to get our fuel pressure regulator, reinstall it, back inside there, clip it till it's home, grab the little circlip, and then push it in. Once it seats all the way, we're done. Reinstall it inside the car. So let's go. So before we put it in, don't forget to get the rubber seal, make sure it sits on there properly. And we're just going to reinstall the pump. Now the pump came out in one direction, so there's an arrow directly at the back of it. It's facing backwards. We have to make sure that that reinstalls in the same way. Now we're going to grab the ring of death, not really, but we're going to grab it. And we're going to start turning that bit by bit until we get it to seat. Okay, so these things can be a little bit of a nightmare sometimes trying to get it started, but once you do, you just wind it on by hand, and then you can grab your screwdriver and your hammer and give it a bit of a love tap to send it home. Now, like I said before, just be careful when you do this. So now we've confirmed it works, we're just going to put all that together. So now that the fuel filter and the spark plugs are done, we've run the car to make sure it starts. We're then going to jack it up and we're going to replace the brake pads and the rotors. First thing I'm going to do is remove the wheels. So what I did to start off with was I removed all the fluid out of the reservoir. So that way when we push the piston back, we're able to remove the brake pads and replace them with new ones. And that way we're not going to send the brake fluid everywhere. So the first thing we're going to do is remove the two caliper bolts. There's one at the top and one at the bottom. We're just going to hit those with a rattle gun, and then we're going to remove the caliper followed by the disc. Now, the reason why we've got this sitting underneath is because when we do take it off, a lot of brake dust is going to go everywhere. Instead of it going all over the driveway, it's just going to catch it in there, and we can also wash it down with a bit of brake cleaner, and it's going to contain the mess. Just going to remove this brake line to begin with. That way it'll give us more access. That'll come straight off. So we're just going to take the caliper off instead, and then we'll get the caliper bracket out. Just going to remove the caliper off to the side. You don't want to let it hang, otherwise it'll do damage to the brake fluid line. Now we're going to remove the caliper bracket. So once we've got the old ones off, we're going to put the new disc on, and then we're going to just do the reverse process of the removal. Refit the caliper, but then we're going to push the piston back at the same time. So we're just going to put the two bolts back in that hold the caliper onto the bracket, and then we'll get a screwdriver in between the caliper and the pad, and then we're just going to push it back. So we're just levering between the pad and the disc to push the piston back all the way. Once it stops moving, it's then gone home, which we can then remove the two caliper bolts and then put the new pads in and grease the slides. So there's an inside and outside pad. Sometimes it's labeled. Generally I put the inside one with this metal tab that is a steel indicator, so when it gets down it'll start rubbing on this, which will then cause an audible sound notifying you that you need to replace your brake pads. Now you want to pull your slides out, which are these here, and we're going to grease those up. Always make sure that when you're changing brake pads or even just checking out the brake system that you pull both of them out and you put a bit of grease on there. We just grab the tub of grease, a little bit on each one. You don't need a great deal, just a little bit, about that's enough. And then you're just going to slide it back in there. This will ensure it goes together smoothly, as well as preventing the calipers from seizing. So once it's in there, we're just going to reapply the brake caliper, tighten up the bolts, and then do the other side. Now always want to be making sure that you check your bolts that you've just tightened up with a spanner or a ratchet. Now I know the caliper bracket bolts are quite tight because I put a new battery in the gun earlier today. So just grab a ratchet or a spanner, depending on what tickles your fancy, and just check the bolts. Make sure that they're tight. So long as they're all good, you can then reinstall the wheel and then do the other side. So we're going to push the piston back first. That'll just make it easier for when we do it, when you put it all back together. So once again, push it till it stops. Grab your socket or your rattle gun, whichever you're using first, and then remove the caliper bolts. I've got my son here helping me, the first year apprentice, as a 2-year-old. So we just slide the caliper off to the side, make sure you don't let it hang directly on the cable. You can just use a cable tie or a bit of steel to hold it up if you're worried it's going to dangle. Move the brake pads off to the side as well. And then we're going to undo the caliper bracket. Ta! Alright, so now we just grab the disc and we're going to put the new disc on there. So take it out of the coating. Now these can come with a coating of a bit of wax on them. It just protects them and prevents them rusting when they are in storage. So if it comes at a different color, you've got 2 options. One, when you bed it in, they're going to produce a little bit of smoke. This is completely normal. After about 500 Ks, the brake pads are going to be worn in. Now you might only get a little bit of smoke for a couple of days, up to a week. If it keeps persisting after about a week, go and seek professional advice. The second option is get a bit of brake cleaner, go over the entire disc, get rid of it. A lot of European cars come out with a small wax film over the top, so it's always a good idea to give it a bit of a blast with a bit of brake cleaner. But in this case, having used these RDA discs before, I'm just going to reinstall them and then we'll take it for a good hard braking application to help them bed in. So reinstall your brake disc, grab your caliper bracket, and put that in, put the 2 bolts on. We're then going to install the 2 bolts and we're going to tighten them up using the rattle gun. Grab the new brake pads and then we're going to fit those in there. Make sure that if they have an inner and outer, that you install them the right way. But in our case, we're going to do the one with the steel tab off the back is going to go towards the piston, so the inside of the brake caliper, and then the other one is going to go on the outside. Yes, that's my son making those noises over there. Try and focus on my voice rather than his. Don't forget, we're also going to pull out the brake caliper slides. We're going to re-grease them. So grab a rag, give them a clean, add a little bit of grease to them as well. Now the grease that I'm using, once again, is just high temp bearing grease. This will ensure the longevity of this caliper slides and prevent them seizing in the future. So installation is exactly the same as before. We're just going to reinstall the caliper onto the bracket. Then we're going to get the rattle gun and we're going to send it. Then make sure we double check it either with a spanner or a ratchet. Going back to what I've said in previous episodes, never trust your power tools and always make sure that you use a jack stand when using a jack. Don't solely ever rely on the jack. Okay, so I'm now satisfied all of those are tight. Time to put the wheels back on and we'll go bedding the brakes. Now bedding in brake pads is quite easy. All we want to be doing is getting up to around 70 or 80 kilometers an hour, applying the brakes and cutting our speed in half. Now the reason why we cut it in half and not to a complete stop is just because if we apply the brakes fully and come to a complete stop, we can cause the glue inside the pads to melt, which then results in poor braking performance. So once you've then dropped your speed by about 50%, you then want to speed back up and do this several times. Generally about 4 or 5 times is fine, but the more the better. Also, you want to ensure that you avoid heavy braking for at least the first 500 kilometers until the brakes are worn in properly. So that's it, guys. Thanks heaps for watching, and I'll see you next time on an episode of Tomo's Tune-Ups, all things DIY and mechanical.